In December of 1944, the Ardennes forest was a place where the theoretical limits of logistics met the physical limits of the human body. Private Henderson sat in a frozen foxhole with his feet numb, waiting for a supply sergeant to hand him a replacement for his rotted footwear. The year was 1944. When the boots arrived, Henderson realized they were not new. He turned them over in his hands and saw the Class B stamp, the permanent mark of second-hand gear. This stamp was a signifier that these boots had already been worn, damaged, and repaired by someone else. As Henderson rubbed the mark, he found himself wondering about the man who had worn them first. He wondered if the previous owner had made it out, or if he was stepping into the shoes of a casualty. For the men on the line, a soldier's life often depended on the integrity of a piece of equipment that had already failed once. This is the part of the story that most accounts skip. We focus on the factories in Detroit and the shipyards in Richmond, but we rarely look at the massive, invisible machine that pulled used gear out of the mud to put it back into the fight. This reality leads to a question that defined the American war effort. How did the Army turn its own waste into a weapon? To understand how a recycled boot reached a frozen foxhole, we must look back 4 years to a military that believed abundance was its only strategy. In 1940, the Quartermaster Corps was a sleepy administrative branch, operating under a philosophy of disposal rather than reclamation. For 20 years, the prevailing mindset had been shaped by the aftermath of the First World War, where the primary goal was simply getting rid of mountains of surplus. The system was designed to be a one-way street where the Army bought equipment, used it until it broke, and then threw it away. There was no industrial-scale mechanism for repair because pre-war planners believed American industry was an inexhaustible spring. If a tent tore or a uniform frayed, a unit simply ordered a new one from the warehouse. This culture of extravagance was guarded by a rigid peacetime regulatory system. General Edmund Gregory, who took over as the Quartermaster General in April of 1940, inherited a department more concerned with preventing fraud than maintaining efficiency. The Army was terrified that unserviceable equipment might find its way into the civilian market and be sold back to the government at a profit. To prevent this, regulations actually mandated the physical destruction of surplus goods. The ledger was safe, but the material was lost. This was the disposal mindset in its purest form, a system that prioritized property accountability over material utility. Officer Vance would sigh as he signed a survey report authorizing the burning of a mountain of slightly torn tents. Nearby, Lieutenant Briggs oversaw the ritual of destruction. Briggs was tasked with ensuring that no corrupt official could ever resell government property. If a leather flight jacket had a broken zipper, Briggs would take a combat knife and systematically slash the leather into ribbons. He was not being destructive out of malice. He was following a manual that viewed every scrap of leather as a potential criminal liability rather than a strategic resource. The manual required that the gear be rendered useless. As the world began to burn in 1941, General Gregory realized that this approach was a recipe for disaster. The United States was about to expand its army from a few 100,000 men to over 8 million. At the same time, the loss of global supply sources for rubber and silk meant that the inexhaustible spring was beginning to run dry. Shipping space was becoming the most precious commodity in the world. Every ton of new equipment sent overseas meant a ton of raw material had to be pulled from a shrinking domestic pool. Gregory understood that the war would not be won solely by the speed of the assembly line. Victory would depend on the Army's ability to manage procurement in reverse. The junk pile became a stockpile. This was the process of industrial reclamation, taking the refuse of the battlefield and feeding it back into the supply chain. It required a total psychological shift for the American soldier. Men raised in a culture of abundance had to be taught the unglamorous, humble discipline of frugality. They had to stop seeing a pile of rusted tin cans or a torn mess kit as trash and start seeing it as a strategic asset. In the early days of mobilization, this was an uphill battle. Training camps across the country still operated with an atmosphere where waste was habitual. Soldiers moved through mountains of equipment from seemingly endless stores, often ignoring the salvage dumps growing behind the barracks. The Quartermaster Corps had to wage a constant campaign to change this culture of carelessness. They had to convince skeptical commanders that a pile of scrap metal was just as vital to combat capability as a crate of ammunition. The transition was a friction-filled struggle against a bureaucracy trying to use peacetime rules to fight a total war. The old money allowance system was scrapped in favor of a new method that treated every uniform as government property. This move centralized control, but it also created a massive administrative bottleneck. Suddenly, the Quartermaster Corps was responsible for the upkeep of millions of individual items. The existing repair infrastructure, consisting of just 25 small shops nationwide, was woefully inadequate for the task. General Gregory saw the crisis coming. He knew that if the army did not learn to fix what it already had, the logistics of the coming offensive would collapse. The era of the throwaway army was over. Officer Vance stood as the mandated disinterested officer, a man whose primary duty was to witness the destruction of government property. His entire job was to watch these items die and sign the survey reports that authorized the burning or burying of the remains. For men like Vance, the paperwork was the primary product of the war. A single pile of torn uniforms required a survey report that had to navigate 8 different administrative alternatives for disposal before a single thread could be moved. This was a functional chokehold on the entire military. While the industrial base was screaming for raw materials, officers across the country were busy ruining perfectly good fabric and leather to satisfy an accounting system that had not been updated since the horse and buggy era. The ledger was safe, but the material was lost. To understand why this mattered, you have to look at the map from the perspective of the High Command. While Briggs and Vance were slashing jackets in a yard, the leadership was realizing that the nation's culture of abundance was about to hit a wall. In early 1942, Major Hull Miller stood with General Gregory before a map of a world that had been effectively redrawn by the enemy. The Japanese had severed the supply lines for 90% of the world's natural rubber and nearly all its silk. Miller pointed out that the army was currently blind buying, purchasing massive quantities of equipment without standardized specifications. They were buying everything they could get their hands on, fueled by a panic that the factories would never be able to keep up with the demand. The supply lines were beginning to snap. Major Miller's reports showed that the department was spending billions on gear that often sat in the wrong places or was produced in the wrong sizes. This was the beginning of the scrap famine. The nation was cut off from the raw materials it needed for tires, parachutes, and insulation. Yet it was still operating a disposal system that burned thousands of tons of those very materials every month. General Gregory realized that the army was essentially a giant machine that took in new equipment at one end and produced mountains of mutilated trash at the other. It was a linear system in a world that demanded a circle. The army was consuming itself from the inside out. The strategic planning of the war depended on breaking this cycle. If the army continued to destroy its own waste, it would eventually run out of the raw materials needed to replace it. The realization hit that the war was a conflict of industry and resources as much as it was of arms. Miller argued that every pound of material recovered from a training camp was one less pound that had to be shipped across a submarine-infested ocean. To fix this, they had to break the bureaucracy. They had to convince an entire generation of officers that property accountability did not mean a clean ledger, but a usable inventory. The junk pile became a stockpile. The tension between the regional commanders and the central planners reached a breaking point. Local commanders wanted to keep their posts looking like country clubs by throwing away junk. The old guard insisted that the disinterested officer and the mutilation rules were the only things standing between the army and a massive public scandal. But the reality on the ground was that the survey report bottleneck was creating stagnant piles of equipment that were rotting faster than they could be processed. By the summer of 1942, the realization hit that the nation could no longer build its way out of the trash pile. The manual was the enemy. By the summer of 1942, the era of the mutilation ritual was officially dead. It was replaced by a directive that transformed every army post into a miniature industrial salvage yard. General Gregory issued the order in June, requiring every post, camp, and station to establish a dedicated salvage officer. This was not just a request for better housekeeping. It was the institutionalization of procurement in reverse. The military was finally acknowledging that the waste of the training camp was as vital as the output of the factory. The machine was learning to feed itself. To understand the friction this caused, you have to look at the barracks. Local commanders, who equated a soldier's morale with the crispness of a new uniform, suddenly found themselves at odds with a centralized mandate. A commander wanted his men to look like the posters, but Gregory wanted them to wear repaired gear so that the new production could be funneled to the ports of embarkation. Major Hull Miller was the man who had to navigate this tension. Miller spent his days buried in reports that showed a terrifying discrepancy. While the front lines were screaming for equipment, Domestic posts were sitting on mountains of unserviceable gear that no one was authorized to fix. The waste was becoming a weight. Miller pushed for the house cleaning directive, a massive, mandatory sweep of every military installation. The goal was to flush out the dormant scrap, the rusted rails, the discarded oil cans, and the piles of old wool that had been rotting in warehouses for 20 years. But this created a new kind of administrative fatigue. A local salvage officer would sit at his desk, staring at a pile of rusted fabric, paralyzed by the conflicting orders. He had to decide if the material was industrial scrap to be sold to a dealer or dormant material to be returned to a depot. The transition was a slow, grinding process of education. The trash was now a resource. This shift led to the birth of the subdepot and the Class X classification. This was the moment the repair shop stopped being a cobbler's bench and became a factory. By 1943, the Army was operating over 300 of these shops across the country. In a typical subdepot, the air was thick with the scent of dry cleaning solvents and the sharp, metallic dust of shoe-stripping machines. The industrialization of the repair shop had begun. This is where we find Sergeant Miller. He was not on a firing range, but standing over a hand-cranked shredder in a salvage shed. His task was a humble one, taking the thousands of tons of discarded cardboard that arrived daily and feeding it into the blades. The resulting material was not trash, but a high-grade, low-moisture packing material that replaced expensive timber. Every bale Sergeant Miller produced meant one less requisition for raw wood. It was a gritty, repetitive job, but it was the literal padding that kept delicate optics and radio tubes from shattering on their way to North Africa. He was protecting the eyes of the Army. Across the same depot, the industrialization of repair reached its peak at the sewing machines. Taylor Moretti represented the new standard of combat serviceable gear. Moretti did not just patch holes, he was part of a system that reclaimed garments previously destined for the rag pile. He would sit hunched over a heavy-duty machine, taking a wool tunic that had been torn or even pierced by a bullet. He restitched the fabric with such precision that the original hole vanished into the weave. His skill turned a casualty's uniform back into a soldier's armor. To understand why Moretti's work mattered, you have to look at the Class X stamp. This was the new code for items that were technically used but met 75% of the wear expectancy of a new garment. When Moretti finished a repair, the item was stamped with a hidden mark. This mark was a signal to the supply chain that the item was fit for the field. It was a psychological hurdle for the men receiving it, but for Hal Miller and General Gregory, it was a mathematical victory. They were successfully squeezing a second and third life out of every yard of wool. The era of the throwaway army was over. This system eventually scaled to a staggering degree. At specialized plants like the one in Buford, Georgia, the Army began rebuilding 5,000 pairs of shoes every 8 hours. These boots were not merely patched, they were sterilized, mechanically stripped, resoled, and refinished until they were indistinguishable from new issue. This was the industrial metabolism in action. The Army was no longer just consuming resources, but was digesting its own waste and turning it back into combat capability. The house cleaning campaign of 1942 served as a frantic period of activity that broke the old country club atmosphere of the peacetime posts. Inspectors general descended on stations to find food being dumped and clothing being burned, forcing a shift toward a culture of frugality. It was a transition that turned the tin dump into a strategic reserve. By the time the first major waves of troops were ready to deploy, the Quartermaster Corps had proved that the American war machine was not just fueled by endless factory output. It was sustained by the relentless reclamation of every scrap of leather and thread. The strategy was no longer just about what you could buy, it was about what you could save. To understand how the Army eventually solved the problem of the scrap famine, you have to step away from the repair shops and move into the silent, massive geography of the depots. By 1944, the Quartermaster Corps was no longer just a collection of warehouses. It had become a high-efficiency engine that processed over 40 million tons of supplies. This was the era of the Silent Revolution, a period where the military stopped thinking about logistics in terms of floor space and started thinking in terms of cubic capacity. Imagine a 5-story depot at midnight, a space so vast that the far walls disappear into the shadows. In the early days of the war, this building would have been a scene of chaotic manual labor, with thousands of men hauling crates by hand and stacking them only as high as a human shoulder. But by 1944, the atmosphere had changed. The silence was broken only by the hum of electric motors. This is where we find forklift operator Davis. He was part of a new breed of logistical soldier, a machine operator who held the power to transform dead air into productive space. Davis maneuvered his mechanical lift through the dim aisles, picking up standardized wooden pallets and hoisting them 18 feet into the air, right up to the roof beams and trusses. In 1943, it took 30,000 workers to handle the domestic supply flow of the army. By 1945, that workforce had been cut to 19,000, yet they were moving twice the volume of gear. Davis and his machine were the reason the tonnage handled per man-day jumped from 4 tons to over 9 tons in less than 2 years. The forklift did not just move crates. It allowed the army to grow its storage capacity from 7 million square feet to 52 million without building a single new warehouse. But stacking the gear was only half the battle. The real danger was losing track of it. This brings us to the logistical ghost. To understand why a misplaced crate was a strategic failure, you have to look at the desk of Clark Thompson. While Davis was moving physical weight, Thompson was managing the weight of data. He spent his nights squinting at the mathematical columns of the MPR, 20X Supply Control Report. This was not just a ledger, it was the technical backbone of the entire Quartermaster Corps. Before this system, the army was blind buying, ordering thousands of items based on guesses and outdated requisitions. Thompson's job was to find the discrepancies. He was looking for the 1,000 wool tunics that the records said were in a warehouse in Ohio, but which had actually been diverted to a port in New Orleans and forgotten. Major Miller often walked these depots to check the reality against Thompson's reports. Miller explained to his staff that an extra 1,000 tunics sitting idle in a domestic warehouse was a ghost that could effectively kill soldiers in Italy or the Pacific. If those tunics were not in the system, the factories would keep spinning to replace them, consuming raw wool and shipping space that the army simply did not have. The new reporting allowed Miller to move the military from a state of panic buying to a state of mathematical precision. It turned the blind supply chain into a transparent pipeline where every overcoat and every ration was tracked from the factory floor to the foxhole. Consider the stakes of this precision. The Quartermaster Corps was uniquely vulnerable to public criticism because their goods, like food and clothing, were the same things civilians were rationing at home. If a warehouse was found full of stagnant uniforms while the home front was struggling, it was a political disaster. Thompson's work ensured that the feast or famine cycles of the early war were smoothed out. He was the one who signaled when to stop the machines and when to surge production, ensuring that the army had exactly what was needed, where it was needed. This shift from manual horizontal storage to mechanized vertical storage, backed by rigorous data control, was the quietest victory of the war. It meant that by 1945, the United States had mastered the art of throughput. The depots were no longer stagnant pools of equipment. They were high-speed transit points. The silent revolution proved that the war was not just won by the man with the rifle, but by the clerk with the report and the operator with the forklift. They ensured that the industrial output of the nation was never wasted by sitting in the wrong corner of a warehouse. The logistical machine had finally caught up to the speed of the front lines. The ghosts were being exercised by the autumn of 1944. The American High Command was gripped by a dangerous collective optimism. They called it shortened war thinking. From the planners in Washington to the staff officers in Paris, the prevailing belief was that the German resistance would buckle before the first snow fell. This was not just a sentiment, it was a policy that dictated the flow of every factory and every depot. Based on this hope, the Quartermaster Corps had begun a downward revision of its requirements, intentionally draining the supply pipeline to avoid a massive post-war surplus. To understand why this decision was so catastrophic, you have to look at the figures for the duck and webbing pool. In late 1942, the Army was taking in 72 million yards of heavy cotton duck for tents and equipment. By late 1943, planners slashed those orders to a mere 2 million yards. They were essentially betting the lives of the infantry on a Christmas victory. But, as the Allied advance stalled at the German border, and the weather turned into the coldest European winter in decades, that supply cliff became a physical reality. The crisis broke when Major General Robert Littlejohn, the chief quartermaster in Europe, sent an urgent, massive requisition back to the States. He did not just need more supplies, he needed an entire industrial category to be resurrected overnight. He was short on heavy tentage, winter overcoats, and the new wool sleeping bags that were supposed to replace the standard blankets. The shortened war delusion had left the frontline soldier exposed to a winter that did not care about administrative forecasts. By the end of 1944, the pressure on General Edmund Gregory reached a breaking point. As the quartermaster general, he was forced to pivot the entire American industrial machine from a wind-down phase back into a total war surge. He had to return to the textile mills that were already transitioning to civilian production and demand they return to a 24-hour military schedule. This frantic attempt to outrun a self-inflicted shortage became known as the 1944 reversal. While Gregory fought the industrial battle in Washington, the reality of the supply failure was being solved by hand in the frozen mud of the Ardennes. This was where the theoretical standard for reclaimed gear met the desperation of the front line. The system of salvage that had been built in domestic subdepots was now being improvised by men who could not wait for a shipment from a port. The answer to how the army would sustain itself was being found in the wreckage of the battlefield. In the middle of a December blizzard, Sergeant Kowalski was not looking for a requisition form. He was looking for a wreck. Kowalski was part of a recovery team tasked with keeping a squad leader's tent from collapsing under the weight of the snow. He found what he needed in a ditch, where a 2.5-ton truck sat with a cold engine. The truck's canvas cargo cover was a frozen, jagged sheet, brittle with ice and stained by smoke. Kowalski did not see a piece of junk, but the only available raw material in the sector. He used a combat knife to hack away the usable sections of the frozen canvas, his fingers numbing as he fought the rigid fabric. He took those salvaged scraps back to a shivering command post and used heavy twine to patch a gaping hole in a squad tent. This was the reclamation standard in its rawest form. It was the difference between a soldier sleeping in the snow or under a roof of scavenged rags. By December of 1944, these salvage programs were no longer just about saving money. They were the only things keeping the offensive from grinding to a halt. The supply cliff meant that new equipment was months away, and the men on the line were surviving on the metabolism of the battlefield. They were stripping the broken to keep the living moving. This period shattered the myth of an inexhaustible American supply line. The Quartermaster Corps spent the final months of the European War in a state of permanent emergency. They were frantically trying to fill a pipeline they had emptied too soon. They learned that in total war, the machines do not stop until the last gun is silent. But even as the guns fired and men like Kowalski fought to keep their tents standing, a new battle was beginning in the boardrooms of the termination branch. The planners knew that while the winter was brutal, the eventual peace would bring a different kind of chaos. To understand the victory of 1945, we must look past the parades and focus on the arrival of a single telegram on a factory floor. For 3 years, the American nation had been a $43 billion machine that knew only one direction. But as the Allied armies closed in on the enemy, a new problem emerged. If that machine did not have an emergency brake, the arrival of peace could trigger an economic collapse as devastating as the war itself. The logistics of the stop were just as critical as the mobilization. By late 1944, the Supply Corps was managing 10,000 active contracts with over 5,000 manufacturers. If the government simply walked away on the day the fighting ended, these companies would be left with warehouses full of half-finished tents and millions of dollars in frozen capital. To prevent a national bankruptcy, the general in charge of supply realized they needed a science of the exit strategy. They called this new process pre-termination. Think about the complexity of a textile mill during the height of production. You cannot simply flip a switch and stop a loom mid-cycle without destroying the equipment and wasting the material. To solve this, the Supply Corps sent specialists into the factories to map out the exact stop work points. This was the industrial equivalent of a controlled descent. Inspector Klein was one of these specialists. He stood in the botany worsted mills with a stopwatch and a clipboard, conducting a test case that would set the standard for the entire industry. He watched as raw wool moved through 11 distinct industrial stages, from scouring and carding to the final spinning of yarn. Klein's goal was to determine exactly how long it took to reach a logical stopping point where the material was still usable for civilian goods. Because of his work, the mill owners and the government reached a pre-negotiated agreement. When the telegram finally arrived, the machines would not just die. They would finish the current stage of production, ensuring that no raw cotton or wool was left as useless tangles. This single administrative innovation turned an accounting nightmare into a 2-day formality. But the real test arrived in August of 1945. When the news of the final surrender hit the depots, the theories of the previous year were replaced by a literal avalanche of paper. In a cramped office in the Philadelphia depot, Accountant Weiss was one of the 3,000 negotiators tasked with unwinding the global supply chain. On VJ Day, the silence in the factories was matched by the frantic clicking of teletype machines in his office. He sat surrounded by stacks of contracts, some totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. As the stop work telegrams went out, Weiss was responsible for triggering the 60-day clock. This was a race against time. Under the new regulations, the government had exactly 60 days to verify a contractor's inventory and remove it from the factory floor. This allowed the companies to pivot back to making civilian goods immediately. Weiss had to deal with the endless lists of buttons, zippers, and specialized fabrics that the government had furnished to the contractors. If he failed to reconcile these accounts quickly, the factories would remain clogged and unable to hire back returning veterans. To keep these businesses from going under, Weiss utilized interim financing. This was a system of partial payments that allowed the government to cut a check for 75% of a claim before the final audit was even finished. It was an act of profound bureaucratic trust that kept the doors of small suppliers open during a volatile month. The transition was a surgical withdrawal. Within days of the surrender, the volume of cancelled contracts was 10 times greater than the total value of all contracts at the end of the First World War. Yet there was no collapse. By using the Joint Termination Regulation to standardize how the government took title to scrap, the Supply Corps managed to dismantle the machine as precisely as they had built it. The war was over, and the economy remained standing. The atmosphere in the depots shifted from the high-pressure surge of 1944 to a quiet, clinical liquidation. The termination branch worked with deliberate speed to dismantle the empire they had built. Within a year of the surrender, the office, once teeming with 3,000 negotiators and accountants, was down to a skeleton crew of 2 people closing the final ledgers. This was the final victory of the logistical machine. The American government proved it could dismantle a global empire of supply with the same precision it used to build it. By treating contract termination as a professional industrial operation, rather than a punitive one, they ensured that the factories were ready for peace before the last soldier even stepped off the boat. The looms at Botany worsted mills were already spinning civilian wool because specialists like Klein and Weiss had planned for the end while the world was still at war. The machines had stopped, but the economy remained standing. Now we return to Private Henderson, staring at that Class B stamp on his boots as the shells whistle overhead in the Ardennes. To understand why he is still standing, you have to look past the frozen leather and into the system that put it there in any other war. A boot that had already failed once would have been a death sentence. It would have rotted in a trench or been tossed into a fire. But for Henderson, that stamp was a guarantee. It meant that back in a specialized plant in Georgia or Missouri, his footwear had been stripped to the welt, sterilized, and resoled with a precision that often exceeded the original factory specifications. The boot did not fail because the army had stopped seeing it as junk and started seeing it as a strategic resource. This is the answer to the question of how the army turned its own waste into a weapon. Henderson survived the barrage and moved forward because the Class B system ensured that nothing was ever truly lost. It was not a miracle of production, but a radical industrial metabolism. The Quartermaster Corps realized that the war was a closed loop. Every pound of wool reclaimed from a torn tunic and every gallon of grease salvaged from a mess hall kitchen was a direct increase in combat capability. By the winter of 1944, the victory was won by the fact that the army had learned to digest its own refuse. The reclaimed boots held the line. As the fighting moved into Germany, the logistical machine began to pivot toward its final, most difficult task, dismantling itself. This was not an explosion of celebration, but a quiet, administrative exit. The global supply chain was severed by the clicking of a teletype machine. For the planners, the reality of victory was an anticlimax defined by a completed checklist. By 1946, the frantic energy of the repair shops had been replaced by the gritty, low-stakes reality of the surplus yard. This is where we find Mechanic O'Malley. He was not stripping boots for the front anymore. He was wiping grease from a machine tool that had spent the war dehydrating carrots for millions of rations. In a civilian world, this machine was an expensive relic with no purpose. O'Malley spent his days labeling these mechanical ghosts as scrap metal. He watched as the electric motors were stripped from the drying bins and sold back to contractors for junk prices. A unit that had cost thousands of dollars was liquidated for as little as $150. It was a cold, necessary process of turning the specialized tools of total war back into the raw materials of a peacetime economy. Nearby, Captain Reed walked through a silent storage field that stretched to the horizon. It was a graveyard of surplus trucks and heavy equipment. a physical manifestation of the war's sudden end. Reed was tasked with navigating the freeze order, a bureaucratic standoff where local depot officers tried to pull equipment back for their own needs, while regional disposal bureaucrats cited rigid regulations to keep the items for sale. To understand the scale of Reed's task, you have to look at the numbers. By early 1947, over $300 million in surplus property was clogging 14% of all available warehouse space. Reed moved through the rows, tagging each vehicle for a piece that had arrived faster than the paperwork could handle. He was the one who had to apply the Clayton formula, a mathematical guide that attempted to calculate exactly how much a truck had depreciated after years of usage in a world that did not have time for maintenance. This brings us back to the desk of the Quartermaster General. As the final ledgers were closed, the department had processed over $21 billion in supplies. But General Gregory was not looking at the massive tonnage reports or the billion-dollar contract settlements. Instead, he kept a simple photograph. It was not a picture of a general or a factory line. It was a photo of a veteran walking down a civilian street. The man was wearing a suit and a tie, but on his feet were those same renovated service shoes. The Class B stamp was still there, hidden inside the leather, a permanent signifier of a war won by saving what others threw away. It was a badge of a system that had turned frugality into a strategic victory. The myth of the throwaway army had been debunked, not by words, but by the millions of items that had been pulled from the mud and put back into service. In that quiet office, the final victory was measured by the silence of a machine that had been dismantled as precisely as it was built. The war ended, and the ledger balanced. If your father or grandfather served in the Quartermaster Corps or worked in the massive supply depots that fueled the front lines, I would be honored to read his story in the comments below. Whether he was a mechanic like O'Malley or a clerk managing the mountain of paperwork, those personal details are the actual record of how this war was won. Thank you for joining us for this history, as there are many more stories left to tell.